insiders are talking your teams. Sports 1280, New Orleans.
Welcome back. Dunc and Holder here at our NOLA.com Times Picayune studios at the foot of Canal Street. And our next guest, Jeff has been lauding our next guest for, I'm talking a good month. You've been lauding him to me about his statistical analysis, breakdowns of everything there is Saints, and he's been telling me, we've got to get this guy on. We've got to get this guy on. Well, Jeff, we've got him on. Your guy. I'll let you introduce him.
Okay, Warren Sharp visits us now. We're very pleased to have him on the program. And Warren, I got to tell you, I looked through your preseason annual and was very impressed with the thoroughness and just the amount of detail you put into this. How long does that annual take you to produce each year? Because it looks overwhelming to me.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, guys. Really appreciate it. It takes, basically I start at the end of February. Once the Super Bowl ends, take about a week or so to decompress, and then I dive right back into it. And this isn't something I've been doing for years and years. I just only started doing it recently because, I wanted information out there that I felt like people could really associate with and understand well. And I didn't really I see a lot of fantasy previews and things of that nature, but I wanted something that was a little bit more analytical, but still able to be related to people, relatable, understandable. So it's a long effort. I finished doing it in about June, end of June, and then I put it out there. So it's basically my entire off season is spent working to collect all the data and then design the magazine.
And one of the interesting things in the Saints preview that I wanted to ask you about that I think Saints fans will find interesting is you do this for every team in the league. You look at their strength of schedule in detail and compare it to last year's schedule. And what's of note for the Saints is that the offense this year is going to face an easier schedule, if that makes sense. Last year they faced the third most difficult schedule. In other words, the third most difficult amount of good defenses, according to defensive efficiency, according to your stats. And this year they will face the 28th most difficult schedule, so one of the easier schedules in the league. But conversely, the defense is going to face better offenses than they faced a year ago. So that's interesting to me. And so I guess there could be reason for optimism and pessimism if you look at those two sides of the ball.
Yeah, if you look at, for instance, like the radar charts, and you get a sense as to how well this offense performed. This is a top 5 offense. You guys know that. They're an incredible offense, seemingly year in and year out with Peyton and Brees there. But they did that against a very difficult schedule, as you mentioned, the third most difficult last year. This year it's going to get immensely easier. Last year they were facing the AFC West, they were facing the NFC West, so they had a lot of really good defenses in there. They're not going to be facing quite as many strong defenses week in and week out from their non-divisional schedule. But then, as you mentioned, conversely, they're going to be facing a lot of really good offenses. So I'm not as big on their overall expectations this season, but I think their offense is going to look and perform much better. I think their defense is going to look even worse than it was last year. And what that tells me is, if you like the Saints for your fantasy team, it's going to be a very good thing offensively, because I think that they're going to be in situations where, they were in this anyways. They won 7 games last year where they have to keep scoring. Well, they're going to have to do that even more because they're going to be playing much more difficult offenses on the other side, and those teams are going to continue to have success scoring against your defense. It's going to force your offense to ratchet it up another notch and continue to pile points on the board.
Warren Sharp of SharpFootballAnalysis.com. Join us right here on Dunc and Holder. You can follow all of his interesting tidbits of everything NFL at Sharp Football. Warren, what do you feel as far as the line, because you do a lot of this too, as far as against the spread and lines and odds and such? Say the first 4 games of the season. Do you think the Saints are going to be favored in any of these games?
Well, actually, one of the things that is in the book is every single team. I published the betting lines that were released in Las Vegas for weeks 1 through 16. So they don't cover Week 17 because that game is always up in the air, but they do actually line the games out every single week throughout the entire season for every single team, and you can actually go out there and bet, hey, I want to bet on the Saints Week 15. You can pick which game you want to bet, and you can bet those lines. Right now, the Saints are underdogs in all 4 of their first games. Now, a couple of those games are on the road, and they're only catching 3 points, which means they're currently a 3-point underdog in Carolina Week 3, a 3-point underdog in Miami Week 4. That basically means that you guys are equivalent to those teams. Las Vegas and odds makers view you guys as equivalent. They just have the home field advantage. But obviously right now, they view the Minnesota Vikings better than you. They view the New England Patriots better than you. So it is going to be a very difficult start to the season, of course, but it's not one that I feel is insurmountable. The schedule obviously gets easier towards the end, where you guys do face some teams that I think that you should be able to beat. But I personally believe that it's going to be difficult to post 9 wins this season. This division itself, it's going to take a number of wins to come out of this division. There's a lot of good teams in your division, and it's going to be a difficult start. But if you guys can get on that head start of that, if you can upset the Vikings Week 1 and maybe win one of these 2 games on the road Week 3 or 4 and get off to a 2-2 start, then you're ahead of the curve, and you might be able to get there.
That's a great point, Warren, and something we've talked about on the program a lot. This season, I think, really hinges for the Saints on how well they can start against that tough schedule. One thing you point out in your analysis that I think Larry and I both agree with wholeheartedly, and probably Saints fans agree with wholeheartedly, is that as great as Drew Brees is, when you really get into the statistical analysis of his performance, he might even be, and I don't know, I'm going to get your thoughts on this, he might be underrated, what he's done here in New Orleans, because he's had to carry this franchise. I can't think of another player that's had to carry a club as often as Drew Brees has had to carry the New Orleans Saints the last few years, and his statistics are quite impressive, aren't they?
I'm shocked that Drew Brees doesn't get a little bit more popularity in the common media. I mean, down there, I'm sure he's beloved and obviously extremely well known. Nationwide, he is more well known, I think, thanks to fantasy football. Everybody's looking at what the Saints offense does every year. It's interesting how fantasy football kind of seeps into all of our visions about the NFL. But from a holistic perspective, he really doesn't get the credit that he's due. As you mentioned, this team and this defense, I mean, bottom 3 defense the last 3 seasons, this has been a squad that's really relied on his performance, and it is a shame, here we are in sort of like the twilight of his career. I don't know how many more seasons he's going to have left, but that they haven't been able to put a little bit better defense around him. Now, I study this a lot with all the teams. You got your salary cap. We know what Drew Brees is allocated, and so it's difficult to build a roster when you're spending as much on a quarterback. And obviously, a team like the New England Patriots, where Tom Brady's taking $14 million cap hits every year, they're able to build out their roster a little bit easier. But the issue becomes with Drew Brees. He played in this era where you had Peyton Manning rising to greatness, and all the battles were focused in the AFC with Brady and Manning, and so he was always like a second fiddle sort of to those guys and to their battles. But no matter what you look at in terms of metrics, what he can do at the line of scrimmage, the accuracy that he presents, he's just so reliable and dependable that it's really going to be a sad day when guys like Drew Brees, even to an extent not as good as Brees, but Phillip Rivers, these guys are at the twilight of their career, and in a few years, we're not going to have guys like that in the NFL anymore, and I'm just not really convinced that this younger crop of talent that we've got is going to replicate the success that those quarterbacks have been able to deliver.
Talking to Warren Sharp of Warren Sharp Football. Warren, one last question here, and I'm really fascinated by this. You keep statistical numbers on close game records and what you call critical and game-deciding stats. That's like turnover margin, return TD margin. And that one stood out to me, and Saints fans are all too familiar with this. The Saints were -5 in return TD margin. Of course, they had a couple of block kicks return, some pick sixes. Those things, in my experience, tend to kind of even out for the most part. Is there a chance that this team just had some bad luck in a lot of these close games and maybe they're due a little good fortune and can reverse that 7-9 record with just a few more breaks here or there.
Yeah, I mean, look, some teams with the turnovers themselves are more related to the quarterback play. Generally, when you fumble the football, it's one thing to fumble it, but then it's another thing. Once that ball's out, either team should have a decent shot at those. So the fumbles lost should be a little bit more neutral. Interceptions, you have to have an aggressive defense to offset an offense who might have a more turnover-prone quarterback. But when you talk about like the sack margin, for example, or the return touchdown margin, the team that wins the return touchdown battle in a given game wins 75% of those games. The team that wins the sack battle wins 71% of those games. We're talking about like literally in that game, if you record more sacks than your opponent, 71% of the time over the course of, the last several years in the league, you will win those games. So, those are vital statistics. They're not just the return touchdowns. Those are instant points. Why is return touchdown such a important factor 75% of the time you win those games? Well, it's because your offense doesn't have to go out on the field. Not only are you preventing the other team from scoring points because you just recorded a turnover, even if it's a punt, generally that's almost like a turnover, except it's not. The other team's not able to score points there. You're then getting the ball and immediately scoring points. So I'm talking about all non-offensive touchdowns, whether it's an interception, fumble return, or a punt return. Those are points that you're putting up without your offense having to get on the field. And we know, even though the Saints offense has been so great, it is difficult when you get the ball to march down the field and convert first down after first down and try to get a couple explosive plays in the mix to help alleviate that and then score touchdowns. And, field goal rates are obviously, teams are more likely to get field goals than touchdowns because it's difficult to get down there and score touchdowns. And to get those 7 points, it is massive. So if they can revert that or even neutralize it back to an even playing field at 0, I do think that there's a great chance to get to 8 wins. But it's going to take more than that, I think. They're going to have to be in the plus category to have a winning season, in my mind, unless they can pull out some upsets here, like we discussed in the first month of the year.
Warren Sharp of sharpfootballanalysis.com. You can follow him on Twitter at sharpfootball. Warren, awesome stuff. We really appreciate you jumping on the show, and we'd love to have you back on down the line to go over what's what, and blows my mind. Oh, it's like you break it down so well. And it's so thorough. But, Warren, we really appreciate you jumping on the show.
Hey, thanks for having me on, guys. Happy to be on anytime.
All right, appreciate it. That's Warren Sharp, sharpfootballanalysis.com. Wow. So if you missed any of that conversation, you better go listen to our podcast, sports1280.com, NOLA.com, iTunes, NOLA.com, SoundCloud page. Jeff, great stuff.
I'm not good at math, so unfortunately you and I both probably need a little remedial work in his analysis because it is quite intimidating. But once you dive into it, it's a deep dive into the analytics of the NFL. And, the Saints have just hired, for the first time, an analytics person because it's becoming more and more popular and a trend around the league.
Absolutely. So let's take a break right here on the show. When we get back, Todd Grappanini, the voice of the Tulane Green Wave. And don't forget, tonight, the Willie Fritz Show should be a lively one at Manning, 7 o'clock. Right here on the station. And look, 1-0 and some momentum going into Navy. So we'll talk with the Graph about that here on Sports 1280, NOLA.com, and the iHeartRadio app with Dunc and Holder.